So we're going to start right now. Everyone, thank you for coming. This is DD as a part of our Institute Industry Innovation iCube seminars for the Data Science Institute students and faculty. I want to welcome Fengmin Gong, who is going to speak to us. He is currently the VP for Security Strategy and head of DD Labs. And let me just tell you a little bit about Fengmin. He's a well-respected technologist in cybersecurity with more than 30 years experience. He's also a serial entrepreneur and angel investor. Fengmin has been a founder and senior executive in several leading security companies. Among them are Palo Alto Networks, FireEye, McAfee, and Cyfort, all very well-known security companies. He's a trusted advisor to many entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. He has 18 awarded patents and over 40 technical publications in security networking. And I guess when he has time to spare, he enjoys travel, outdoor activities, and photography. But I wanted to make a little personal mention of how Fengmin and I know each other. And we didn't actually discover this until we met just last year, or he remembered and I didn't. But Fengmin and I first met after I had just finished my PhD in 1983, and I took a trip with a bunch of student types to China. And this is 1983 in China. This is like soon after Nixon opened up China. So Fengmin was one of the students who, in China, helped host our student group. And we had a marvelous time. He was a wonderful host. And it is just absolutely amazing to me that many years later, I meet him, and he's like the head of DD Labs, and he's not in China anymore, and he's doing so well. And it's just, it's such a heartwarming story. And so Fengmin, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a DSI industry affiliate for representing DD Labs.
Sorry. When you have a group, right, graduates from MIT, Berkeley, it's definitely, for me, it was a very inspiring event and activity. So does this sound it's working? Okay. I would take, hopefully we're shooting for 20 minutes, right? Less is always good. Definitely, we have been doing a lot, right, from ride sharing, trying to see how we can transform transportation, right? It's a big challenge. And then AI, of course, is right in the middle of that. And myself and the team, we have been also doing a lot of thinking. Of course, we know also the initiative right here at the Data Science Institute. So this is mainly sharing some of the thoughts, but there is a process I feel when we do things every day, we are thinking about, you have to think things through, right? And then you have to translate it into action. And then, you also have to tell people, communicate to people. So actually, I think it nicely works in this sense. So that's the main kind of theme. So we all have heard a lot, right, about this industrial revolution. You can call it a new model, but the way, if you look at to the right, some of the key forces, right, people are talking about new energy. Clearly, we are motivated to look for new energy. And then also some of the things powered by AI in general automation, people are talking about new manufacturing, and we can all think of, 3D printing or different things. And then, of course, the advancements on a lot of biofront, bioinformatics. I mean, people indeed are thinking very boldly. If you look at all this, of course, there are a lot of promises, right? Clearly, it's really, hopefully we'll have unprecedented increase in productivity. with that, there are a lot of things. If you think big, from the clean air and reduced congestion all the way to longevity and good life. But at the same time, indeed, because this is such a big change, a big challenge, and there are many unknowns. Some of them basically affect how we can actually achieve, harvest, the power of AI. Some of them is, what are the consequences? That's why if you look at some of the, obstacles and fears, just a few, clearly it's upon us considering the compliance versus innovation. We have all those debates. And then you have things related to basically how we are going to implement things, apply AI. There is abuse and there is even just unintended consequences, as part of the ignorance and uncertainty. If you look at this with jobs and contribution and then overall the wealth, that's indeed, people are also talking about that because it's such a fundamental impact. So this is actually a busy slide. This is where I want to share some of the things I was thinking of trying to look at this problem, we have run into things on the right-hand side, just a few examples, coming from security. And we have been looking at security, today in the connected world. For us to do security defense, we have to work together. So that's fundamental. We actually come to that realization. But today, if you look at how we are interpreting some of, let's see, the weapon, how you interpret that, how you interpret the security research results, if it's classified as a weapon or not a weapon. And that has very interesting implication on sharing versus control. That could affect us, And then if you look at the green box, this is just one way to look at some of the things we are trying to do today. If you think of the face identification, think of, doing various DNA-based prediction, That's kind of like the initial impulse of the kind of thing we think we can do. And then, of course, how do you translate that, into results? Then you have to go through this training, what data set do you use, how do you validate, your model? And of course, it has consequences, The consequence, depending on the application, could be access rights, could be job eligibility, or could be the medical care, And so that's the kind of things we are facing. Then if you look at also from any entity, anyone want to do innovation, from a duty and responsibility perspective, we have already faced the privacy concerns, the identity, and also the national interest and ethics. So one way, when I was looking at this, we can think of it in terms of the dimensions of impact. And we always start with the basic and something we can, it's tangible and we can actually implement, That's, starting from productivity, then you can think of it impact the employment, and then the individual well-being, Everyone in terms of in the society. Then maybe at the national level, easily you have to face the social fabric. All the way to the top. I think to the top probably become more global. It's a world we all live in, indeed. If you look at, I would think of the impact, of course, from the top, any of the decision, how we decide to do it, would impact a lot more. But then, of course, that also affect or how we implement, how we choose to do it, actually would affect it. And so that's one way we can look at it. Of course, when it comes to how it affects our everyday activity, our research, this is where we will have to kind of drill down a little more from this general dimension. One way, as an example, we already can look at this notion of, framing, think of game. Of course, sometimes I think it's not a good analogy, but sometimes people do use it. Do you have a, win-win is possible, or do you have a zero-sum game? That affects us. I think from some, high-level decision all the way to how we actually do research project in collaboration. I think it's very important. Then, of course, clearly we are going to be have to look at this fairness question. So this is where what we do when we build the system and it finally have actual effect. The effect could be equal access, could be equal impact, and this is where you could have things of bias by design. Maybe it's intended, not intended, right? Most of the time, probably not. The other one, very interesting, is strictly about unintended consequences. Here, just the example in terms of damage by negligence or bias by ignorance. And I have to say, when I was looking at this one, I cannot help but think of some of the recent things happened with Boeing. I have tremendous respect. I know Boeing as a model of how they do reliability and design. But this time, the way it happened, right? I think a lot of people still are doing soul searching. Why or how did it happen, right? To me, some of that is there. So of course, given from DD, and I have been doing a couple of things at the very high level. I think indeed, right, because what we are setting out to do in terms of our mission, there is a lot of good opportunities indeed. I mean, actually, desirable things. Some of the things I listed here, definitely, we started right. Wanted to do provide a better journey, but we realized we know safety, security is definitely job number one, and then of course all the things goes with the rights, right? In terms of for all the users, if they can have more available and faster rides, as a part of that process, clearly. One of the things is, we're faced with reducing the traffic jam, reducing the carbon footprint. And then in this process, indeed, we are already in our ecosystem, right? We have passengers, we have the drivers, and then we actually have other collaborators. Clearly, this is where the fair participation, how do you do it, come in. And of course, not to underestimate, right? It's very important in terms of effective government and enterprise partnership, because we are engaging such a big task. Definitely the government is right there meant to do all the things, right? Then how do you work together? So in the end, right, indeed, I mean, we initially motivated, and what we want to do is to build that better journey, right? This is where we have to think about how do we leverage AI and the big data to actually do it right. Coming from security, so I'm going to use the security as one example, right, to illustrate how we understand this, right? Even if you just start with just writing safety, right? And clearly, then in the middle, there are different levels of either you can think of approaches or methods, right? How do you get there? We definitely have to think about, admission control for people to the platform. We have to think about how do we predict, assess, right, potential risk and what to do. And then during the ride, clearly you have to do adequate and good monitoring. And then when something happens, you actually can help intervene. And when when unanticipated event, right, does happen, response is very important, because in the end, right, it's how people are taken care of. So now if you think of that, then further look into actually technology means. That's where you have to have reputation data to help you make some of the decision. Clearly, you have access control, you have authentication, then access control. And of course, the safety profiles from the vehicle to region and everything else. And real-time behavior monitoring, and even the health emotion, because this is where it's very interesting. Think of today, we have driver in there, and driver have a lot of perception work done by the driver itself. And the moment we have autonomous driving, and just the passenger in different situations in needs, you just have to sense it, you have to respond, and also have to sense sometime to be proactive. Then, of course, I mean, when something did happen, right, you have to have assist. So the interesting thing is, to do all this, right, we need some of this support, and at the same time, there are data and network security issues come in and directly affect those, right, from the traditional network to how do we deal with user-generated data. And, how interesting today we start in US, right, we start thinking about this problem. We talk about Facebook. And then, of course, the personal privacy data. It's very important. And from a good perspective, right, we can see AI both for helping us to do the driving behavior monitoring and also for providing user interaction, right, for that experience, right. That's things you can clearly see it would enhance that system much better. And this is just give you a feel because we look at when you do have a fleet, right, with basically potentially mixed, vehicles driven by drivers and also vehicles that could be self-driving. So from day one, right, when we introduce the AI and the state of the art of the AI machine learning today, we know its fundamental limitations, right? And in particular, a lot of them are affecting the perception. Basically, today it cannot generalize to things that it have not seen. So that's why we believe a framework that is data fusion driven, it's remote intervention based, is very critical to assure the safety and security. To the right, you actually see some of the critical information sources or intelligence, if you will, that we have identified, we believe the system have to work with. So this is what it will give us information beyond a single vehicle, beyond just a vehicle, right? It's very important for you to know, to assess any risk and things when you are actually on the road. So with those information, then we want to be able to build different models to assess the risk and then to assess, based on the design, the policy, what kind of safe posture we can take, right? This is where some of the things we talked about earlier, right, in terms of different dimensions of impact. I think in the end, what that is meant for us to do is to help us prioritize. When we have different levels objectives, then at this kind of juncture, when you have information, when you want to make a decision, those dimensions, those hierarchies will help you to say, okay, what I'm going to do, right? And you're going to have trade-offs, you're going to have dilemmas, and then ultimately you have to have an overarching safety kind of guidance, right? And then in that framework, for you to decide how are you going to risk that, mitigate that risk. And of course, that have to translate into implementation, reflected in how the car is going to drive, right? How we're going to respond. And then we want to have this closed loop to be able to validate and to evolve. So this is something in general, we believe we have to have this framework, and we have to use this framework then to assess how are we doing, are we ready, what area we can go to, what we can do to deploy, for example, the autonomous driving. So this is about the communication. I mean, I know this, in general, we are realizing communication actually is important, but it's increasingly hard to do it effectively today, right? If you look at some of the things, on this list, and of course, dealing with people's nature and all those are one part of it. But if you look at, in particular, the fourth point I will jump to, right? Just by today, I think the task, the challenge we are facing, the complexity combined with how we are virtualized, right? This, I use it in a very broad sense, not just the server virtualization, but think about how much of our interaction today is through the network, through all those intermediaries. So that is where I think, indeed, I mean, we have to put more emphasis on the communication, because in order to do this challenge, to collaborate, you have to communicate. And this is where, you know, from our perspective, right, if you look at, or in general, AI application, we definitely always have to do something with a purpose, and then there are users, right, that they are the first. But then you are doing it in a society within the, you know, the governance, right? So this is where you have to work together in actually to achieve what you intend to achieve. Then, of course, the other elements where it definitely help us both making sure that we do not have blind spots in when we make a decision, but also overall, right, to connect technology with society needs, and that's where, you know, both scholars and think tanks, right, come in. On media, and fortunately or unfortunately, right, we like one aspect of it, maybe certain things you can get a lot of open communication, you hear it quickly, but what you hear when you ask if there's how much trust I can give to it, and that become a challenge. So that's about the communication. Now, quickly, this just give you a general idea. I mean, today, right, for DD, we already have operation, of course, China, Brazil, Mexico, and also Australia, Japan, and also provide service in Hong Kong, a number of places. But in addition to those, then we have offices try to be close to where our service are. Like you know, the DD Labs and in Mountain View and in LA, we are actually leveraging what we can do closer to support, for example, the solution localization for Brazil and for Mexico. And so quickly, just a few examples, some of the things we have done in terms of encouraging the collaboration. And advance the AI. And one thing, and some of you may have heard, is our Gaia project. And so this is mostly definitely, you know, already sanitized data, mostly about in order to convey people the trends and the traffic distribution, right, in basically geofenced regions. We actually share this data for the researchers to do the traffic modeling, so on and so forth. So domestically, you know, we have about you know, over 1,300 registered applicants, and globally already have people from more than 20 countries, 140 plus organizations involved in this data. The main data today on these sets. One set is concerning the trajectory, so people can use it to do the traffic distribution estimate modeling. And the second set is actually in those regions, certain regions, how people leverage, for example, POI, point of interest data, in their travel. So that also helps for us to understand people's needs. And this I will skip over, and when you are interested, I mean, definitely there is a simple process. The key is you register, and then, of course, we want people to be able to use the data responsibly. Although we have sanitized, we make sure there is no privacy or any of those data, but how you use data should also be governed by certain rules, no abuse. And this is actually the newest from Guobin's team. We have released this one as part of the CVPR challenge, right? The interesting thing is, you know, we have over 10,000 video clips, and in this case, some of them are already labeled and some of them are not labeled. So for people to actually be able to use this data to experiment and solve some of the challenges. How do you do learning training across domains, for example? So this is the newest one. First will be used at the challenge. And this just give you an example, some of the data in there. Let's see. Yeah. nothing special about this. Just give you an idea why this data are important, because depending on where you are going to run into all kind of scenarios. And in particular for autonomous driving, right? You want to make sure that your perception, your system actually see those cases, right? It's all about discovering potential corner cases and risk cases for the system to be able to deal with. So this is my last slide, and definitely we believe, right, we can harvest the power of AI by actually working diligently together. I think some of the key, it's also part of our own lesson, right? We really need to listen to really hear, to solve real problem, real needs. That problem selection is a very critical first step. And then, the second and third is really about how you do it. I think this is where some of the things we mentioned earlier depend on how if you are diligent, if you have blind spots, that you may face, right, unintended consequences, right, to say the least. And then I think it requires us to be able to openly communicate and talk about both what we are trying to do and how we are doing it. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much again, Dr. Gong, for your presentation. So my plan today in the next half an hour or so was to sort of cover ride-sharing ecosystem from the sort of policy sides all the way through to the technological aspects. And we do have a diverse panel, so I think we can treat those things all very, very comprehensively, even this evening in a half an hour. So I wanted to sort of get the ball rolling. Maybe I'll ask Professor D a quick question just to get things started as to what perspectives you have on the impact of ride sharing on cities and mass transit systems in general.
So I think there are many aspects of the impact. People are also in discussion about whether ride sharing actually affect the traffic congestion, whether they save like parking spaces. And what my research is about is to try to model whether the introduction of these emerging transportation technologies will affect the traffic congestion or not. So what they are trying to do is to basically they assume we have already existing travel modes, and now we have this e-hailing or ride sharing kind of services. So they are basically also looking with their revenue perspective, and they are taking case. So people basically are competitive, and ride-hailing companies are also competitive. So they are deliver. So how people will choose it and what's the timing? Okay, sorry. Probably I speak a little too soft. Basically, I think people are saying, especially there was discussion in New York City before whether the introduction of Uber Lyft actually affected traffic congestion. The report said no, but later on, the mayor still decided to cap the growth of this. I think the key point is whether Uber has Uber Pool, Didi also has some pooling, so whether that will really help. So that I think the ride-sharing service will definitely improve this kind of service. It brings the convenience to people's life. Also, we actually, sorry, I don't know whether my answer is too long.
No, it's okay.
So yeah, we have a related project with Didi. So we are trying to say, given we have the current number of drivers from Didi, and also the demand, whether we can basically provide some optimal guidance to the drivers after they drop off the previous passenger, so that they can quickly find the next passenger. I think that will really reduce these idling trips and will improve the traffic efficiency. Okay.
So maybe Costa, from the business side of things.
Business side.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but so I think it's well known that many of the large ride-sharing companies companies maybe are operating at a loss and to some extent are subsidizing rideshare. So when we make choices, we maybe are making a choice between an artificially reduced price and perhaps public transportation as urban residents. And I'm just wondering, maybe what perspectives you have. There's obviously congestion pricing is coming to New York City for all vehicles. I'm just wondering what your perspectives might be on the impact of ride sharing under these subsidies on our general public transportation and what maybe the role is of government agencies to regulate.
Good. So let me step back a little bit. So and dovetail a little bit about what Sharon was saying. Ride sharing or ride hailing in general, essentially as a technological solution to sort of enhance transportation options within urban environments have been impactful. Okay, there have not been impactful transportation outside, I think, major urban centers yet. So that's something that. So their impact is mostly felt in big cities where there is a big concentration of potential riders, and that this is where sort of the technology is most impactful. One place where most ride sharing now in the U.S., I think, is sort of single rider gets into a car with one driver. I mean, or me and my wife or something like that. But in some sense, there is not a lot of sharing that is happening yet. It has been essentially a product that has changed the way we go from point A to point B. It can be tremendously beneficial in a city like ours, to the extent that we will start incentivizing people to do more sharing. All right? And now I switch back to the economics that you were saying, because so it is true that some of these, for purposes of market penetration, and others may actually know more that work in the industry, this service may be a little bit subsidized at times, and as a result, it's kind of like it becomes cheaper than, let's say, getting a yellow cab, and it's not entirely clear why they should be so cheap. It's great for us, but it's not entirely clear why it should be so inexpensive. We're now in a state in New York, in a state of time in New York, where we're exploring the possibility of adding, let's say, a congestion tax. And there's already been a small charge that is being actually imposed on yellow cabs and on sort of Uber, Lyft type of cars in the city, Vias. What's unfortunate so far is that this charge, or our discussions about how to do that, are not actually focusing in how to use sort of this regulatory mechanism to incentivize the right behavior within the city, right? Ideally, what do we want? We want people to share cars so that we can reduce the number of cars, but still get people from point A to point B very effectively. Certainly what we've done so far is not doing that particularly well, and I hope we'll be able to influence the dialogue in the city to actually achieve that better outcome. For example, in London, I think congestion taxes were very successful when they first came out, but they're not particularly successful anymore. I mean, it's like constant gridlock in London. I happen to go reasonably often, and I'm always stuck in traffic when I'm in London. And people say that right after the introduction there was a reduction, but that was before, let's say, Uber and other Uber-like firms entered the market and essentially introduced another, K-1,000 cars, going around. So I don't know whether the subsidies that have been imposed have been aggravating some phenomena so far. I mean, the subsidies that have been imposed have been affecting some established players like yellow cab drivers in this city, let's say, and probably in other places. But But I think what we would like is more price differentiation, like from the point of view of not of a user, but from the point of view of somebody that lives in the city. What we want is more product and price differentiation, so that we can actually get people to share. Perhaps in a slightly different mechanism. Perhaps we should have little shuttles that go down Broadway. I mean, New York is a particularly great place to actually experiment with all of these things. And, you know, get 90% of what you want to do with fewer cars. That's ideally where we want to go, right? And I think economics will play a role in that, because that's a lever that is actually, we should be able to tweak that so that we can incentivize the right behavior.
So maybe on that, Professor Dr. Gong, what sort of, and I'm not necessarily asking you to speak for the entire company, but what sort of cities would be ideal for ED to engage with strategically? And I'm thinking of this from, obviously from an industry point of view, your business, but I'm thinking of it also from the demographic of the city, the spatial distribution of work and residential. Like, where can DD, let's say, have to do the most good? What types of cities? And if regulation was, let's say regulation encouraged ride sharing from transportation, like public transportation hubs out to residential areas, maybe that area where there's a limited connectivity, would those be areas or types of cities with those types of regulations which would be appealing and where you could maximize good? I'm just trying to figure out, you know, where can ride sharing really have the most beneficial? I use it all the time here in New York City, so I'm not bashing ride sharing. I love ride sharing, but where can it have the really? I mean, good is across lots of different metrics. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very good question. I don't know if I can give you a good answer. It's really, I think some of the fundamental things clearly is, for one, is in terms of the demands, right? We always have to look at the demands in terms of unmet demands. That's one. And then the other thing is, then in this case, have some infrastructure that can play is a good thing. What I meant by that is, if you look at DD, of course, people generally think about ride sharing. But we very quickly, we believe, you know, we are trying to come up, right, with a system to basically provide a better, more efficient transportation system. So this is where today we have a real effort in different places. We are experimenting with this notion of one-stop mobility. So on the platform, we actually have the ability to check the public transit schedule. And of course, not to mention, and you guys probably aware in some of the cities, right, the bike. So I noticed like in Beijing, right, that's where you mentioned one scenario very similar. They have a lot of those software parks. The interesting thing is, you know, the subway goes to outside the park somewhere. Then you typically have, you know, maybe from 2 kilometers to, you know, maybe 5 kilometers, some area varies, that you don't have good coverage for people. And so we have, since with bike, we found in those software park area, people use the app to actually, you know, get off the subway and then just get a bike. A lot of them are actually doing it that way. And then the ride is very similar. So it's overall, I think we just believe you have to look at this and to see the ride sharing. You have the car dispatch, how is that going to work with the public transit and also the bus. And what we have done in some other areas is when people do use the app to look up and to take the bus, and we actually are able to work with the city
in terms of looking at their bus route efficiency. So just those are all at an aggregate level, and just to see the ridership, and then maybe the route was not as reasonable. So those are the kind of things actually we do. So clearly, number one is the demand, and I think, and then the existing infrastructure. Of course, when there is some, it's better, maybe more complex, coordination, collaboration. But it doesn't preclude us from doing it. Definitely a city and the government that is very forward-looking, are willing to look at this problem, right, for a systematic solution, and that will be very good to work with, yeah.
So Yash, maybe another question. I know you're interested in sort of the design of markets, and so you think that there are, let's say, aggregators, price fare aggregators for ride shares. There's lots of different ride-sharing companies, and I'm wondering if you have sort of thoughts on, how others, let's say, cities want to get into the ride-sharing business. I mean, obviously, right now, the major players, Uber, Lyft, Didi, big companies, obviously, are dominating that space. But I'm wondering if there's perhaps room for other types of paradigms.
Thank you. So I actually, again, I want to step back a little bit and expand the discussion a little beyond just ride-hailing and transportation. And partly I'm biased because I work more generally on design and operations of marketplaces. So that's ride-hailing being an example, and that is a topic I work on. So I mean, for one thing, I think the discussion about the welfare impacts, this is spot on, and it's something that we don't fully understand. And some of the big players like Didi, but also big players in other spaces, could do well in contributing quantitatively to what are the welfare impacts. Just trying to understand, trying to quantify these numbers, and putting out the analysis for discussion and improvement with some sort of healthy discussion with experts and so on. So I think that would help a lot. But the other question I have is it what would it take to unlock the full potential of the sharing economy, and including things beyond the established kinds of platforms? Maybe there is some entrepreneur in Africa or in India or in some other part of the world where there is no chance to hire hundreds of PhDs and so on, but they identify a pressing need for something, and they know what the product should look like. They know who can be on board, how to bring them on board, but then they don't know how to run this platform, for example, or they may even struggle in figuring out how to allocate their energies between bringing the different stakeholders on board and so on, the different potential users. Can we have some sort of community ecosystem, a template to support such a person to actually bring their idea to fruition? And this question applies equally to Dr. Gong and Didi, and also to academics like many of us here. What can we do to support this? Can there be flexible software which is shared, for example, to support key and ubiquitous functionality? This could be like matching and scheduling, pricing, reputation, recommendations. 4 out of 5 of these things are going to be a part of pretty much any platform. And can it be such that any engineer, any smart engineer with a bachelor's can take that software and use it to build their platform by tuning it? Or does it really need these hundreds of PhDs? And is there any way in which, academics should be doing this instead of just consulting for Uber or Didi and making a couple million on the side? But is there any way that this kind of vision could align with anything that Didi does as well, or is it just in contradiction with the profit motive of Didi to actually support this type of ecosystem? And does it have to be then that you would try to acquire those companies, or can there be a broader perspective taken?
I guess we should let Dr. Gong try to respond.
No, I think it's less of probably a question for me. I'll follow up with that, and actually also with the previous discussion on basically carpooling, right? I think we do have some experience there. We looked at that very seriously. For instance, it's indeed we need to encourage, right, the sharing behavior. What we found was, for most of the people, probably, then that means, at least for the riders, right? You have both riders and the drivers. You have to think about their benefit and interest. And for the riders, clearly, availability is actually very strong play in their mind, right? With pooling, and we know during the rush hours they will go for it because they know they get a car quicker. And then, of course, with that, and you have to balance out the convenience. So that means, ideally, you want for the passenger to be cheaper when they are doing, if you can do it. At the same time, the driver may be, actually making more money. So this is where, it's careful. You have to make sure that you balance all those to provide this service in that very targeted fashion, right, to encourage that behavior. Coming to in general, I think it's a great idea. This is where you need almost like consumer or advocacy, and then be able to maybe help to organize a lot of voices, so that way you can have a more effective dialogue, right? And for DD, and we believe we have to be open. Both the passenger and the government are all constituents with drivers. Unless you figure out a way to work together, then you are not going to go far, right? So I think it's a necessity, and it comes down to how do you actually accomplish it, yeah.
Okay, so let's say switch gears now, pardon the vehicular reference, but let's switch gears to self-driving autonomous vehicles, and I'll turn over to Junfeng for a question to you. And Dr. Gong mentioned this in his presentation as well, that once you have an AI for autonomous vehicles, there's a question of sort of fault tolerance control, in other words, and if you train a neural network, it's only going to be as good as things that it has seen, or things like it. And so I wonder what your perspectives are on the future sort of robustness of autonomous vehicles, and then we can get into the technology as well.
Thanks for the question. So I guess if you look at how AI is used or will be used, self-driving definitely is one of the biggest applications. There use AI to recognize pedestrians on the road, or whether the road curves to the left or right. You're actually making a lot of safety critical and mission critical decisions using machine learning models. And beyond self-driving, there are a lot of other applications that are kind of critical, and we use AI in this application as well. For example, face-based authentication, and earlier Dr. Gong mentioned admission control. DD probably uses some AI, some machine learning as well, right? So in general, we're using AI more and more for a lot of critical decisions. But at the same time, for within the community, right, a lot of researchers understand that. Machine learning, these AI models, they're far from safe or secure, right? You can take, an image and tweak a few pixels, and then feed this, slightly modified image to a machine learning model, and the model may actually give you a wrong prediction, right? Imagine that you're in a self-driving car, right? And the sun becomes a little brighter, and then the self-driving autopilot tells you to drive to an oncoming car, right? So those kind of errors are typical for today's machine learning models. So I think a big challenge is how we can bring some engineering rigor into this process of building machine learning models and make them more secure and robust. So I guess for a long time, if you look at the focus of machine learning scientists, researchers, they've been focused on how we can improve accuracy on the test data set, right? But the fortunate thing is now that we're using these models more and more in critical applications, industry, academia, they realize that we need to come up with additional research technology to ensure reliability. So it's kind of similar to software, right? Like we're using a lot of software, and if you look at how the industry produces software, they're using all sorts of testing, code review, bug finding tools. They do staged deployments. And you look at academia, you got researchers in software engineering, programming languages to come up with all sorts of methods to improve reliability of software, right? I think the same thing will happen to machine learning, to AI, right? So that's a critical step in the investment we need to do so that we can have safer and reliable, AI, right? And I guess fortunately, I think the DD as a company is, also very keen on improving the reliability of machine learning. We have a joint project thanks to Dr. Gong, Chen-Xi, Guobin, and Tony. So we're working on how we can make the machine learning models more robust and make fewer mistakes.
So just a follow-up question, and anyone can answer this, but it seems to me that to make self-driving vehicles truly robust, there need to be sort of really fail-safe aspects, and that might be at the software level and at the hardware. And it seems to me that there will be some responsibility then placed not just on the vehicle, but also potentially on the infrastructure. I'm just wondering who is financing the infrastructure requirements to potentially enable self-driving vehicles in urban settings.
So you're talking about someone sponsoring the renovation of our roads to add like sensors and stuff so that we can avoid accidents?
It's really much more than that. It's going to be communications and sensing and computation potentially to override. So if your neural network misidentifies something, what takes over? From a point of view of public good and safety, I'm just wondering. I think there's probably going to be some need for cities to invest in infrastructure that would override sport. So anybody can take this question, but I feel that it's not all going to be on the vehicle.
So yeah, I think many people now have this suggestion is we cannot just rely on the self-driving car itself to basically move around the traffic in this complex environment. What we really need is the connectivity and the communication between cars and between car and the infrastructure. So previously, I think the solution is more was proposed from the DOT, and then they tried to propose so-called DSRC. It's a dedicated short-range communication technology, but that requires basically DOT to invest billions of dollars, and the government is not willing to do that. So they proposed some rulemaking maybe 3 years back, but then there's no progress. So that's why now we see a lot of this telecommunication companies try to push this 5G. And also, I think we have this Cosmos, which has like more 5G and beyond technology, wireless communication technology, because they have ultra low latency and bandwidth. So that will definitely enhance that. I think then probably this business model is more like reasonable than from the government perspective.
I'll add quickly. I believe, maybe 5G may not be government controlled. It may not be appropriate. But you mentioned the smart infrastructure aspect, and this is where today, right, local government, the city owns those public streets, right? They maintain it. I think it just makes sense from that perspective for them to be able to then be responsible for installing and maintaining that infrastructure. where you could have camera and LiDAR, right, installed at particular intersection, and that information made available to whoever, right? It could be private drivers, could be autonomous, anything. The city can deal with that in a number of ways, how they want to fund it. But that definitely should be, one very reasonable way to do it. Yeah.
So maybe following on that, and if anyone can take this question, but I'm wondering what would sort of the ideal data sharing arrangements be from the point of view of the city to a ride-sharing company, that in the context either of ride-sharing or autonomous vehicles? Because if there's a burden on the city to build out infrastructure to support these new types of new modes of transportation, then there should be some give and take and some beneficial flow of data from ride-sharing companies. And just maybe you can take that.
Yeah, I'll make a brief comment. And in general, yes, we believe sharing is going to be very important, but then the critical thing is going to be what are you going to share and how are you going to share it. And I think this is a very important consideration, right, for both the government and for private company. If you look at, I believe one principle needs to be, what you can share, assuming that you already established, right, the needs for that sharing, have the responsible party. But the sharing is better stay at the aggregate level instead of going to any individual either feature, preference identification. This is where we definitely have some of the experience in China where basically we help because we have some of the smart traffic system based on our fleet. We can estimate the congestion, the heat map at different places. And that information goes to help the city department to then do their planning or doing their change improvement to the road. So that kind of thing, I think, that is, from these companies, right, to the government. Then, yeah, maybe when the government have the infrastructure, they can do a trade to provide some other information, right, to help the autonomous driving to be safer. Yeah.
Yeah, I may be naive, but I've never understood why that isn't mandated. In general, it's very easy to provide, the trips, the speeds in real time. Obviously, each company has it, so to share that with the city is highly beneficial.
Yeah, I don't know if real time or some of those. Basically, it again comes down to ultimately you need to make sure in the data you share is aggregated, cannot be reverse engineered into the individual, location, things like that. Yeah.
So there is one important talking about data going the other way from the companies to researchers, let's say, and to the government potentially. One big question right now is about congestion pricing again, and incentives to make people want to do X rather than Y, and to really design these incentives well. Whoever is going to do it, whoever is going to come up with prices, which apparently I read is like some group of people from the Triborough sort of bridge, whatever, right?
Yeah.
They need to understand, in some sense, what's the price of time for individual riders at different points in time, at different times of day, different weather conditions, origin destination pairs, and in some sense, I don't actually think they have that information to be able to come up with an educated decision. The firms that have a lot of that information are actually the ride-hailing firms because they've been collecting information with consumer interaction where consumers respond to delay signals, and somehow they can actually, they're much better equipped, I believe, to allow us to estimate, let's say, delay sensitivity that riders may have. That would be a very interesting data set to share. I mean, I'm self-interested in that because I've been working in that problem for about 20 years with different motivating examples. But in some sense, to be able to put our hands on actual people making decisions where they're trading off money with time, it will be very interesting, and that will be interesting from a regulatory point of view in thinking about how we need to, how the city should actually be doing something. I thought I'll say a comment and then I'll pass the baton. Going back to your comment from what's an ideal city, one comment that I was thinking when you were asking your question is this debate that we've been having in this country lately, which is, well, firms are riding on infrastructure, and that infrastructure was built by other people's money. And in some sense, and then we are actually congesting that infrastructure. We want to have better infrastructure, and somehow, we need to pay for that, right? And presumably the government needs to get funds from somewhere in order to pay for that. And the government is having a very difficult time making the argument that, we need to tax again or increase taxes across the broad population as opposed to kind of like having a sort of more tailored solution. So, for example, installing infrastructure in every intersection in New York City may be something that should be, paid for by users of that technology as opposed to, So it's a big discussion on how to do it, and it's kind of a dysfunctional discussion we're having in this country, and I don't want to sort of move the conversation in that direction in any way, but it's important. It's important because, in some sense, that infrastructure is crucial in the efficacy of the system that rides on it. But we would love to have data to estimate delay preferences of riders.
Yeah, this is very quick. I mean, the data can be used to estimate the delay sensitivity of riders. The other input to calculate the right congestion cost is going to be the marginal impact of adding more cars in terms of adding congestion and then slowing rides down for everybody, not just the ones who are using the platform, right? And that again, if I'm sitting in my ivory tower, it's hard for me to do, but not for a company like Didi.
So on that note, so we should wrap up. I just want to thank all of the panelists.